Hey everyone, ready to dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so today we're getting granular with how Austrians see their environment, hopes, fears, the whole nine yards. And we're lucky enough to have some fresh data to dig into.
Really interesting stuff.
Mark Tagent just released this survey, right? Talking to 1,000 Austrians about biodiversity.
1,000. That's a pretty impressive sample size.
Definitely makes you pay attention to the results. And get this, 65% of Austrians know the term biodiversity.
Which on the surface sounds pretty good, right?
Right. But only 26% feel like they really understand it. So we've got a knowledge gap here.
Yeah, and that's something we see often, but what makes this really interesting is that 7 out of 10 Austrians, they see a direct link between biodiversity loss and, well, the health of our planet and humanity.
Yeah, so it's not just about, saving the rainforest somewhere far away.
Exactly. It's personal.
It hits home.
And speaking of hitting home, this survey tells us that nearly 60% of Austrians are seriously worried about the state of nature, here and now.
I was really struck by that number, too. And, when you look at their top 3 anxieties, it's the oceans, it's natural disasters, and it's pollution, and all of those are above 70%. You'd think living in a country famous for its natural beauty might make you a little less anxious about these things. But it seems like
It's the opposite.
yeah, there's a real sense of urgency bubbling up.
It makes you wonder if maybe we're seeing a turning point here, Public awareness. Is it finally reaching a critical mass? Because Austria's natural beauty, it's not just pretty scenery, it's a huge part of their identity. So to see this level of concern surpassing even global trends in eco-anxiety, that's a big deal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it really gets even more interesting, I think, when you start to think about what those concerns might mean for, people's everyday lives.
Right, because it's all connected.
Exactly. And remember that knowledge gap around biodiversity that we were talking about.
Right, yeah.
This survey also found that over half of Austrians are worried about the economic risks of biodiversity loss, and not just globally, but for Austrian businesses specifically.
Yeah, and that's where bridging that knowledge gap, I think, becomes really crucial. Because when we say biodiversity, we're talking about, the amazing variety of life on Earth. We're talking about the teeny microorganisms in those alpine meadows, the complex ecosystems of the Vienna woods. It's not just a list of species. It's the whole interconnected web of life.
Right, it's the whole shebang.
Exactly. And it's what keeps our planet healthy.
Okay, so for those of us who need it broken down, what does that actually look like? On the ground, what's at stake for, the average Austrian?
Okay, so think about it this way. Austria's economy, it's really tied to its natural resources.
Tourism, agriculture.
Exactly. Tourism, they thrive on those beautiful landscapes. Agriculture needs fertile land and predictable weather. And even industries like forestry, they're all connected to a balanced ecosystem.
Right, it's all tied together.
And biodiversity loss, that throws a wrench in the whole system.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly.
So it's not just about, saving a rare species of butterfly. It's about ensuring that these industries that affect everyone can survive long term.
Exactly. We're talking about food security, the stability of those landscapes that attract so many tourists.
It's a big deal.
It is.
Wow, okay. So knowing all of this, that their livelihoods, the environment, those iconic landscapes, they could all be at risk, what do Austrians think needs to be done? Who do they see as responsible for taking action?
It seems like, while personal responsibility is definitely there, this survey really points to a desire for some big picture changes.
Okay, so are they looking to the government then?
Yeah, Austrians are really looking to their government to take the lead, and businesses too.
So what kind of action are we talking about? Like stricter environmental rules and regulations?
Exactly, that's a big one. The survey shows they really want to see those regulations get tougher and, stronger enforcement to protect those amazing natural areas.
Makes sense.
Oh, and limits on land development, too. They're really concerned about development disrupting those delicate ecosystems.
So it's not just about, remembering your reusable shopping bag.
No, definitely not.
Thanks.
We're talking about changing the way things are done at a much higher level.
Systemic change.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is they're ready to put their money where their mouth is.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a lot of support for things like taxes on products that are harmful to the environment, and even incentives to get businesses to prioritize sustainability.
So it sounds like there's a real appetite for action, both from individuals, but also, like you said, that systemic change. But it makes me think about that knowledge gap we talked about before, right? Like if people aren't totally clear on what biodiversity is, how can we expect them to really get behind the solutions?
That's such a good point, and it actually ties into something else really interesting from this survey.
Okay, what's that?
So they asked Austrians about this thing called, get ready for it, planetary boundaries.
Planetary boundaries. Okay, that sounds a little intense.
Right. It's kind of like a sci-fi movie, but it's actually the scientific framework for understanding the limits of our planet. Like, how much can we actually push things before they go really wrong?
So kind of like a budget, but for the planet.
Exactly. And these boundaries, they cover things like climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, 9 key areas. And the survey found that only 36% of Austrians actually knew what the term meant.
Wow, so only about a third. That's a pretty big gap.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile that with this desire for action that we're seeing?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Once they explained the concept, kept it simple and clear, a whopping 80% of those surveyed said that they thought planetary boundaries were either important or very important.
Wow, so it's not that people don't care, it's just that maybe they're missing some information, right? Like that saying, knowledge is power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, yeah, okay, let's be real for a second. Are we actually pushing past these planetary boundaries? Is this like a doomsday scenario?
Well, I don't want to be alarmist or anything, but scientists do agree that we've already crossed the line on several of them.
Like which ones?
Well, climate change is a big one. I mean, globally, we are way into the red zone. And for a country like Austria, which is so reliant on those alpine ecosystems, well, the impacts of a changing climate are becoming more and more obvious.
Yeah, I mean, you think about those ski resorts facing shorter and shorter seasons, or the glaciers that are like literally shrinking.
Exactly.
It's like those iconic landscapes, they're changing right before our eyes. And it brings us back to biodiversity, which is what we're diving into today. How does that fit into this whole planetary boundaries framework? Well, actually, biodiversity loss, that's another boundary we've really overstepped.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. Biodiversity, it's like the foundation for a healthy planet. So when we lose species and we disrupt ecosystems, it's like this ripple effect. It impacts all the other boundaries, making them even more unstable, more fragile.
So it really is all connected, and it makes that sense of urgency that we talked about, well, even more understandable. But before we move on, there was one more really fascinating thing in this survey that I wanted to bring up. You remember that rights of nature concept that we touched on earlier?
Oh, yeah, giving legal rights to nature itself, like rivers, forests, even entire ecosystems.
Right. It's a wild idea.
Totally. And it's gaining traction.
It is. And what's crazy is that while only about a third of Austrians were familiar with the concept, 70% of them actually believe that recognizing those rights, making it law, would lead to better environmental protection. That's huge. 70%. That's incredible.
It is. It really shows you that there's this like fundamental shift happening, right? Where we're starting to rethink our whole relationship with the planet.
Not just as something separate from us, but
as something we're a part of.
Exactly. Yeah. So we've got this really interesting picture starting to emerge here, right? We're seeing Austrians, they're really worried about the environment, but at the same time, there are these gaps in their knowledge, especially when it comes to these bigger ideas like we were talking about, planetary boundaries, rights of nature.
Right. But even with that, we're seeing this really strong desire for action.
Totally.
Both on an individual level and, like we talked about before, pushing for those systemic changes too.
Yeah. And maybe, just maybe, that openness to new ideas, to seeing things differently, that's where the real potential for change is,
Absolutely. It's about making those connections. When you understand that, the health of the Alps, those glaciers, it's not some abstract thing. It's not separate from your life, from the economy, from the future of Austria itself.
It makes it real, right?
Yeah.
It's not just some, save the planet poster. This is about us.
Becomes personal.
Exactly. So for everyone listening, I want you to picture this. What if the Danube River, the Vienna woods, even just the wildflowers in your local park, what if they had legal rights?
I love that.
How would that change, how we think about building things?
Development, pollution.
Everything. Yeah. Our responsibility to protect nature.
It's a big question, and it's one that, I think really forces us to look in the mirror and reevaluate our relationship with the natural world, not as something separate, not as something to exploit or protect, but as something that we are fundamentally a part of.
And maybe, and I'm going out on a limb here, maybe that's what it takes.
That shift.
Yeah, that shift in thinking is what it's going to take to really create a future where, people and nature, we can both thrive.
In Austria and beyond.
exactly, globally. Well, that's our deep dive for today. But if you want to go even deeper on this, we've got a link to the full market attendance survey in our show notes. So check it out. Read it with this conversation in mind. And as always,
Stay curious.
stay curious and let's all do our part to protect this crazy, beautiful planet we call home.